Hello to the wonderful audience of Sci-Fi stories. We have a sincere and polite request to share before we begin. YouTube has unfortunately disabled monetization on our channel, leaving us without a budget to operate. If you find today's story captivating, please consider supporting us with just $1. Your contribution allows us to pay our dedicated staff so they can cover their living expenses and continue crafting these stories for you. You can support us by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the donation link in the description or the comment section. Thank you so much, and please enjoy the story. No one feared the new girl. On a station built for the titans of the galaxy, she looked like a stiff breeze could break her. She was quiet, impossibly frail, and carried no malice in her eyes. But nobody bothered to ask what it takes to survive in the dark, and nobody knew what it truly meant when a Deathworld survivor finally moved. Cedric Bolin adjusted the collar of his pristine white uniform, suppressing a yawn. As a senior systems engineer on the Ethelgard, his job consisted mostly of watching perfect machines run perfectly. The Ethelgard was not merely a spaceship. It was a massive mobile research station and a super yacht, designed specifically as a shining monument to the elites of the core worlds. Everything here was padded in velvet and gold. The floors were lined with acoustic dampening foam to prevent the harsh sound of footsteps. The ambient temperature was eternally fixed at a comfortable 72 degrees. The air always smelled faintly of engineered pine and lavender. It was a fortress of absolute, uncompromising safety, which naturally bred a culture of stifling boredom and suffocating arrogance. The crew members, born into unearned wealth and planetary stability, spent their days debating abstract theories, sipping expensive synth wine, and admiring their own brilliance. They knew absolutely nothing of danger. To them, danger was just a mathematical error, something easily corrected by a diagnostic algorithm or a cleaning drone. Then came Alara Vance. She was a botanical specialist transferred from some forgotten frontier colony, and she stood out like a jagged, dirty rock in a perfectly manicured garden. Alara was exceedingly thin. Her cheekbones were sharp, her complexion pale, and her posture perpetually coiled, as if her muscles were always waiting for a signal. She moved completely silently, rarely speaking unless directly addressed, and possessed an aura of complete and utter harmlessness. The core worlders dismissed her immediately. To them, she was just another charity case from the Rim, a malnourished nobody who should be eternally grateful just to breathe the Ethelgard's purified air. But Cedric noticed things. As an engineer, he was trained to observe patterns, structural integrity, and anomalies. Alara was a walking anomaly. During their shared shifts in the hydroponics bay, Cedric watched her perform a series of bizarre, invisible rituals. Whenever she entered a new room, she would pause for exactly 2 seconds at the threshold. She was not admiring the architecture or reading the directory. She was wetting the tips of her fingers and raising them slightly to measure the direction and strength of the airflow from the ventilation grates. He noticed her lips moving slightly as she walked the long, gleaming corridors, silently counting the exact number of steps from her workstation to every single emergency exit on the deck. Strangest of all, she never stood with her back to the polished chrome pillars in the central atrium. She always positioned herself at a precise angle so that any reflective surface served as a rearview mirror, allowing her to monitor everything happening behind her. It was not mere paranoia. It was a calculated, unconscious geometry of survival. The true turning point in Cedric's mind happened on a routine Tuesday morning. They were in the primary testing laboratory, surrounded by the soft hums and glowing blue lights of advanced equipment. A malfunctioning robotic arm twitched on the ceiling rail, accidentally knocking a solid glass containment cylinder off a high observation shelf. It shattered against the titanium deck with a sharp, violent crack that echoed through the quiet room. The core world scientists jumped in shock, spilling their morning drinks and immediately whining about the sudden noise and the terrible inconvenience. They complained loudly to each other, waiting for the automated cleaning drones to handle the mess. Cedric, however, had been looking directly at Alara. The moment the glass slipped, before the sound even registered in the minds of the other scientists, she was gone. She did not flinch. She did not gasp or scream. She simply vanished from her chair. Cedric peered down over the edge of his console. Alara had slid fluidly under the heavy titanium workstation. She was crouched on the balls of her feet, perfectly balanced, her breathing completely silent. In her right hand, she tightly gripped a jagged 6-inch shard of the broken glass, holding it in a reverse grip specifically meant for severing arteries in close-quarters combat. From the time the cylinder broke to the time she was armed and hidden in a defensive posture, exactly 0.5 seconds had passed. Then, her eyes scanned the room, realizing there was no actual threat. Without a single change in her blank facial expression, she placed the glass softly on the floor, dusted off the knees of her uniform, and stood back up as if she had merely dropped a pen. No one else had seen it. The others were still complaining about the spilled coffee, but Cedric's heart was hammering violently against his ribs. That evening, unable to shake the terrifying image of her cold, lethal efficiency, Cedric bypassed the standard crew registry. He dug deep into the restricted personnel archives, looking for the truth about Alara Vance. The file he found was frustratingly barren. Her homeworld was listed simply as Tartarus 9. When he tried to pull up the planetary data, the screen flashed a crimson, high-level security lock. There were no climate reports, no export statistics, no cultural summaries, and no geological surveys. There was only a single, ominous warning string attached to the planetary code. It read, "Settlement not recommended." He looked around the pristine dining hall the next day. The rest of the crew was laughing, tearing into synthesized steaks, and arrogantly debating political philosophy. A few tables over, Alara sat completely alone. Her back was pressed firmly against the solid bulkhead wall, and her dark eyes scanned the room in rhythmic, methodical intervals. Her colleagues walked past her, throwing condescending glances her way. They openly mocked her. "Did you see her flinch when the airlock cycled this morning?" One senior researcher sneered, taking a sip of his wine. "It is the disease of the starving frontier. They have weak nerves. Put them in absolute paradise, and they still jump at shadows." "She is just an eccentric weirdo," another laughed, shaking his head. "Leave the poor savage be. She will learn how to relax eventually." They genuinely thought her hypervigilance was a trauma response, a pathetic sign of weakness. They thought they were the apex of civilization, untouchable and supreme inside their velvet-lined space station. Cedric looked at Alara, noting how she had subtly repositioned her chair by 3 inches, just to avoid the temporary blind spot created by a passing serving drone. She was not a traumatized victim jumping at shadows. She was something else entirely. And for the first time in his life, Cedric felt a deep, primal chill run down his spine that the ship's perfect environmental controls simply could not warm. The Ethelguard's endless monotony shattered on the 14th day of their current sector patrol. The deep space trawling nets had snagged something highly unusual from the icy void. It was a colossal, calcified mass of biological rock, a drifting enigma roughly the size of a standard heavy shuttlecraft. The board of directors, men and women whose veins pumped liquid greed instead of blood, immediately declared it a triumph. They did not see a bizarre alien anomaly. They saw exclusive patents. They envisioned revolutionary biotech contracts and profit margins climbing by hundreds of %. Against standard quarantine protocols, the executive order came down to drag the entity directly into the primary isolation bay for immediate structural analysis. The air inside the ship buzzed with a festive, arrogant energy. The elites genuinely believed the universe existed merely to provide them with new toys to dissect. For the very first time since she boarded the vessel, Alara broke her impenetrable silence. She did not file a polite inquiry through the proper channels. She bypassed the botanical division entirely and marched straight into the central security precinct. Cedric, running routine diagnostics on the command terminal nearby, watched the scene unfold with a growing sense of unease. She slapped a hard-copy emergency petition onto the polished desk of Chief Security Officer Kalen. She demanded the immediate jettison of the biological mass into a nearby star. She cited microscopic evidence that everyone else, blinded by the promise of wealth, had completely ignored. Through the initial scan feeds, her trained eyes had caught faint, localized corrosion patterns on the exterior crust of the object. They were not impact craters from micrometeorites. They were acidic burn trails, a highly specific signature of organic decay, designed to slowly eat through solid matter. Chief Kalen simply leaned back in his ergonomic leather chair. His uniform was heavily adorned with shiny metals, won entirely in simulation suites, and his ceremonial armor gleamed brightly, completely untouched by real combat. He offered her a condescending, infuriatingly patient smile. He explained, using the exact tone one might use to soothe a frightened toddler, that the Ethelgard was equipped with a Class 8 kinetic barrier system and a proprietary energy force field that had cost over 50 billion credits to develop. He assured her the containment cell was absolutely, unconditionally invincible. He explicitly advised her to return to her greenhouse and leave the complex safety protocols to the seasoned professionals. Alara did not argue. She did not raise her voice, nor did she try to convince him further. Her face went completely slack, and the fading light of urgency in her eyes was instantly replaced by a cold, dreadful resignation. She simply turned and walked away, her footsteps completely silent on the metal deck. A tight knot of pure anxiety twisted in Cedric's gut. He abandoned his diagnostic console and quietly followed her down into the lower residential sectors. He watched her slip into her personal quarters, and, driven by a terrible nagging curiosity, he overrode the lock on her door, just enough to crack it open. What he saw defied all ship regulations and terrified him to his core. Alara was not packing a bag to leave. She was systematically dismantling the room's life support control panel. With terrifying speed and mechanical precision, she was ripping out the heavy-duty backup capacitors and thick copper wiring. She was splicing them together with modified pieces of a salvaged communications link to construct something highly illegal. Cedric, recognizing the crude but highly effective circuitry, realized she was building an improvised electromagnetic pulse generator. He pushed the door open, the loud hiss of the pneumatic seal startling them both. He stepped inside and demanded to know what she was preparing for, why she was aggressively destroying company property, and why she was acting like a violent war had already started on their peaceful ship. Alara did not stop her hands from rapidly stripping the insulation off a wire. She did not try to deny her actions or offer a polite excuse. She finally paused, looked up at him, and offered a gaze so profoundly exhausted it made him feel utterly naive. "The thing that kills you is not the claws of the monster, Cedric," she said, her voice a flat, dead whisper that carried no emotion at all. "The thing that kills you is the belief that that glass wall cannot break." She went right back to her work, leaving Cedric standing paralyzed in the doorway. He eventually retreated to his post, deeply haunted by the chilling certainty in her words. The day slowly bled into the artificial night cycle. The ship grew quiet, filled only with the soft hum of the life support systems. Then, at exactly 0200 hours, the unthinkable happened. Across the entire super yacht, the biological monitoring sensors flickered, went completely black, and then smoothly rebooted. It lasted for exactly 2 seconds. The night shift engineering crew yawned and dismissed it as a minor software glitch, a tiny hiccup in an otherwise flawless system. Nobody cared. Nobody logged a formal safety complaint. But when Cedric, acting on pure instinct, pulled up the internal security feed for the lower decks, he saw the final, terrifying proof of Alara's warning. Inside her dark quarters, Alara was not wearing the standard issue cotton sleepwear. She was lying flat on her bunk, her eyes wide open, fully strapped into a heavy, multi-layered atmospheric survival suit. Her makeshift electromagnetic pulse device was resting right on her chest, her fingers wrapped tightly around the trigger. While the rest of the station slept in luxurious ignorance, she was fully dressed and waiting for the end of their world. The containment cell fractured with a sickening wet crunch that violently shook the primary isolation bay. The heavy, reinforced glass did not merely shatter. It dissolved into a puddle of corrosive sludge. Immediately, the red emergency strobes flared to life, bathing the pristine white corridors in a bloody, frantic warning. Then, they abruptly died. The automated distress klaxons were silenced mid-wail, leaving only the sound of grinding metal. The onboard artificial intelligence went completely dark. The entity inside the quarantine zone was not the towering, lumbering behemoth the corporate board had eagerly fantasized about. It was a nightmare of a fundamentally different scale. It was a biomechanical parasite, a shimmering, stealth-capable horror that flowed like liquid silver and jagged bone. It possessed the terrifying ability to assimilate both metal and flesh. It fused instantly with the surrounding laboratory equipment, blending heavy titanium plating with its own pulsating raw sinew. Chief Kalen and his elite response team rushed the bay with overwhelming force. They were heavily armored, supremely confident, and armed with state-of-the-art military hardware. They lasted less than 3 minutes. The security guards deployed their kinetic shields and fired volley after volley from their high-yield plasma rifles. The blinding energy blasts did not burn the creature. Instead, the parasitic mass eagerly absorbed the searing heat, weaving the raw plasma into its own unnatural biology to supercharge its movements. The creature became a blur of razor-sharp appendages and assimilating tendrils. The pride of the Ethel Guard transformed into a slaughterhouse. Kalen's arrogant commands turned into gurgling screams as his ceremonial armor was violently absorbed into the beast's shifting bulk. The parasite stripped the flesh from his bones, using his organic matter to fuel its rapid expansion. Deep inside the secondary technical core, Cedric backed away in pure terror. He was trapped. 3 senior research scientists huddled tightly behind him in the dark. They were hyperventilating, weeping uncontrollably, and pulling at their own hair in absolute panic. The air in the confined space smelled heavily of ozone, burning plastic, and fresh blood. Only a single mechanical blast door stood between them and the rampant slaughter outside. It was exactly 20 centimeters of solid titanium alloy, a barrier specifically rated to withstand a localized orbital strike. Right now, it was groaning in absolute agony. Deep, agonizing metallic shrieks echoed through the small room as the center of the heavy door began to bulge inward. Jagged, biomechanical claws punched right through the ultra-dense alloy, as if it were wet paper. The metal warped, melted, and began to assimilate around the invading appendages. The scientists screamed even louder, pressing their bodies against the cold back wall. Death was steadily tearing its way inside. Suddenly, the overhead ventilation grate shifted. It did not crash to the floor. It was lowered gently, with absolute, silent precision. Alara dropped into the room. She did not gasp. She did not shout panicked orders. Her facial expression was a terrifying void. She moved with a chilling, predatory grace, fully encased in the multi-layered survival suit she had worn to bed. Despite the heavy gear, she neutralized all sound. Every single footstep was perfectly calculated, rolling from heel to toe to absorb kinetic impact and mute her presence completely. She bypassed the hysterical, flailing scientists without offering them a single glance. She positioned herself directly in front of the buckling blast door, lowering her center of gravity. The blast door finally gave way. It tore open with a deafening metallic screech that ruptured eardrums. The shimmering, semi-transparent mass of the creature lunged forward into the core, hungry for fresh biological matter. It was completely invisible to thermal and optical sensors, a perfect, undetectable killing machine. Alara did not reach for a standard-issue laser pistol or a plasma rifle. She raised the crude, taped-together device she had meticulously built in her room. She slammed her palm onto the trigger. A massive electromagnetic pulse erupted in a tight, concentrated directional cone. The creature's sophisticated cloaking field shattered instantly, like brittle glass. The parasite materialized into plain sight, convulsing violently as its stolen technological components forcefully short-circuited. It was momentarily stunned, completely exposed, and fatally vulnerable. Alara did not hesitate for a fraction of a millisecond. In a terrifying blur of motion, she thrust forward. She wielded a makeshift spear, forged from a super-dense thermal exhaust pipe she had salvaged earlier. She drove the jagged point straight up, sliding flawlessly under the creature's heavily armored mandible. She bypassed the thickest plating and found the exact biological coordinate of its central nerve ganglion. She pushed upward with brutal, devastating force, severing the connection in a single strike. The massive beast instantly went rigid, let out a mechanical death rattle, and collapsed into a lifeless heap of twitching limbs. The entire sequence, from the door breaking to the creature dying, took under 3 seconds. The technical core plunged into a suffocating, ringing silence. The surviving scientists stared, mouths agape, completely frozen in sheer, unadulterated terror. The nightmare beast lay dead at their feet, leaking dark, corrosive fluids onto the deck. Alara did not celebrate her victory. She did not check to see if the others were injured. She simply planted her heavy boot firmly onto the creature's skull and violently wrenched her improvised spear free. She knelt down, running a gloved finger along the shattered ridge of the alien's hardened carapace. "They evolved," she muttered, her voice devoid of any surprise or relief. "The armor is 2 millimeters thicker than last hunting season." Cedric stopped breathing. The words hung in the bloody air, freezing the blood in his veins. A profound, icy dread wrapped completely around his spine as he realized this apocalyptic event was nothing more than a routine chore to her. Alara kicked the shattered remains of the alien carapace aside with the tip of her heavy boot. She did not lower her weapon. She turned her cold gaze toward the ventilation shaft above them, analyzing the subtle changes in the airflow. The 3 senior scientists on the floor were weeping openly now, their hands trembling violently as they clutched each other. They babbled about rescue protocols, offering Alara millions of corporate credits, priority stock options, and guaranteed promotions if she would just escort them to the primary escape pods. She completely ignored their pathetic negotiations. She looked directly at Cedric. "That thing was merely a foraging drone," she stated, her voice cutting through the hysterical sobbing of the elites like a scalpel. "It lacks a primary reproductive tract. These biomechanical parasites operate on a hive intelligence model. They require a massive thermal energy source to gestate their young. The mother node has already breached the main fusion reactor. She is nesting inside the core, absorbing the raw radiation to fuel a mass replication cycle. The life support systems are already failing. She is venting biological spores into the oxygen supply to slowly paralyze the remaining crew. Within 2 hours, the air will be completely toxic to human lungs." The lead scientist gasped, clawing at his throat in phantom agony. "We have to hide. We have to barricade the doors." "You can hide and die," Alara replied flatly. "I am going to hunt. Cedric, I need a structural engineer to bypass the manual safety bulkheads around the reactor core. You are the only person in this room whose heart rate has dropped back below 120 beats per minute. You can still hold a datapad without dropping it. You are coming with me." Cedric swallowed the thick lump of terror in his throat and nodded slowly. The pampered elites screamed in protest as Alara firmly locked the blast door behind her, sealing them inside the technical room while she and Cedric stepped out into the bloody, flickering corridors of the Ethelgard. They were not running away. Alara was actively turning the luxurious superyacht into a brutal, unforgiving battlefield. She moved with ruthless efficiency, commandeering every resource she could find. She led Cedric into a heavy maintenance closet and began rapidly tearing apart standard cleaning supplies and maintenance tools. She instructed him to use his override codes to alter the localized gravity and atmospheric pressure in the adjacent hallways. "Drop the atmospheric pressure in Sector 4 by 60%, she commanded, rapidly stripping the volatile lithium-ion cells from heavy-duty emergency flashlights. "Create a pressure funnel. We need a controlled vacuum." She began mixing industrial-strength ammonium hydroxide from the floor cleaners with crushed synthetic fertilizer from the botanical gardens. She packed the highly reactive chemical slurry into empty metal canteens, wiring them to the exposed lithium batteries. Cedric watched in pure awe as she weaponized basic chemistry. She was constructing crude, highly unstable thermobaric explosives. When the aerosolized ammonia disperses in a low-pressure environment, the lithium spark will ignite it, she explained mechanically, carefully placing the makeshift mines along the corridor walls. The primary blast will not kill them through kinetic force. It will consume 100% of the available oxygen in a fraction of a second. The resulting vacuum will violently rupture their internal pneumatics and collapse their biological lungs. We are going to suffocate them with fire. The terrifying brilliance of her tactics became apparent minutes later. A swarm of 4 hunting drones scuttled down the opulent velvet hallway, their active camouflage shimmering against the dim emergency lights. Cedric triggered the pressure drop. The sudden change in the atmosphere sucked the drones forward, directly into the kill zone. Alara detonated the charges. A blinding wave of superheated gas expanded through the corridor, instantly followed by a horrific, sucking implosion. The armored parasites convulsed wildly as the massive pressure differential crushed their internal organs. They collapsed, smoking and broken, without ever getting within 50 feet of their prey. But the enemy was highly intelligent. By the third ambush, the parasitic hive mind began to adapt. The creatures stopped charging blindly down the center of the hallways. They adjusted their thermal signatures to blend in with the ambient heat of the ship's burning wiring, and they started crawling along the high ceilings to avoid the floor-based tripwires. Yet Alara was always 3 steps ahead of their evolutionary curve. When the next pack of drones dropped from the ceiling, they found that she had deliberately repositioned the blast vents, channeling scalding industrial steam directly into their path to melt their optical sensors before systematically executing them with her makeshift spear. Cedric watched her move through the carnage, and a profound realization struck him. He looked at her eyes, expecting to see the wild, dilated pupils of an adrenaline rush, or the burning fury of a cornered animal. There was absolutely nothing. Her pulse was completely steady. Her breathing was perfectly measured. She was not fighting for her life. She was fighting with the cold, emotionless habit of a person who had been doing this exact same violent chore every single day since the moment she was born. She was the ultimate apex predator, and the alien invaders were just invasive weeds in her garden. They reached the heavy maintenance catwalks, located directly above the primary fusion reactor. Below them, the massive glowing sphere of the reactor core pulsed with a sickly, corrupted purple light, swarming with thousands of tiny, squirming biomechanical larvae. They were perfectly positioned to strike the mother node. Then, the fragile, luxurious architecture of the Ethelgard failed them. The ship was built for comfort, not for the heavy concussive force of continuous thermobaric explosions. A weakened structural support beam above them suddenly gave way, snapping a highly pressurized coolant line. A violent secondary explosion ripped through the catwalk. A jagged shard of heavy titanium shrapnel shot through the air and tore deeply into Cedric's right thigh, violently severing the muscle. He collapsed onto the grating, biting down on his sleeve to muffle a scream of pure agony. Hot, bright crimson blood pumped rapidly from the terrible wound, pooling onto the metal floor. The distinct, iron-rich scent of fresh human blood instantly flooded the ventilation shafts. Below them, the massive hive paused. A deafening, collective screech echoed up from the reactor room. Dozens of heavily armored Guardian drones immediately detached from the walls, their optical sensors locking onto the chemical scent of the bleeding prey. Cedric pressed his hands desperately against his leg, trying to stem the heavy arterial flow, but his hands were slick and weak. He looked up at Alara. She was already calculating the angles, weighing the defensive odds against the incoming swarm. "Leave me!" Cedric gasped, his skin turning a sickly shade of pale. "You cannot drag a bleeding engineer and fight off a dozen Guardians at the same time. The blood will only draw the entire hive away from the core. Use me as bait. Leave me here and drop down to kill the mother node. If you do not stop her right now, she will breed thousands more and consume this entire sector of space. Go." Alara did not even blink at his noble, pathetic request. The cold logic of a standard survival protocol dictated that she should immediately leave the wounded behind to ensure mission success. But Alara did not operate on the terrified, fragile logic of normal prey. She operated on the brutal, unwavering code of a predator, looking after her own pack. Without uttering a single syllable, she dropped her heavy boot to the floor and knelt beside him. She completely ignored the advanced, pristine medical kits hanging untouched on the adjacent wall. Instead, she reached into a concealed, vacuum-sealed pouch hidden deep inside the layers of her survival suit. She pulled out a dense, fibrous clump of pitch-black moss. It looked like dead earth and smelled overwhelmingly of iron and dried blood. "Bite down on your collar," she commanded in a low, even tone. Before Cedric could even process the instruction or formulate a question, she shoved the raw, alien flora directly into the gaping, ruined flesh of his severed thigh. The resulting agony was absolute and blinding. The dark moss reacted violently with the fresh oxygen and his human blood. It expanded instantly, calcifying into a rigid, organic cast. It aggressively bonded with his torn muscle fibers, sealing the ruptured femoral artery in a matter of seconds. The excruciating fire radiating from his leg faded almost instantly, replaced by a heavy, icy numbness that spread completely from his hip down to his toes. It was an extreme, horrifying biological mechanism, completely unsanctioned by any medical board, but it worked flawlessly. "Stand up," she instructed, grabbing him by the shoulder and hauling his dead weight upward. He nodded weakly, relying heavily on her seemingly impossible physical strength. Together, they retreated into a heavily reinforced electrical substation just off the primary maintenance catwalk, sealing the massive titanium blast door firmly behind them. The distant, clicking shrieks of the hunting swarm echoed through the grating outside, confused and agitated by the sudden, inexplicable disappearance of the fresh blood trail. Cedric slumped hard against the cold metal wall, his chest heaving as he tried to regulate his breathing. He looked closely at the frail, quiet girl standing in the dim red emergency light. She had just slaughtered an alien nightmare with a piece of scrap metal and patched his severed leg with dirt. "Why?" Cedric whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of shock and profound exhaustion. "They treated you like absolute garbage. They mocked your habits every single day. They called you a starving, paranoid savage. Why are you risking your life for a ship full of arrogant, wealthy fools who actively despise you?" Alara sat down on a heavy supply crate across from him. For the first time since she had boarded the luxurious Ethelgard, the carefully constructed mask of the timid, harmless botanist completely shattered. Her dark eyes held the immense, crushing weight of 1,000 dead worlds. "You still believe the sanitized lies your pristine academies taught you," Alara said, her voice dropping into a dark, resonant register that sent a chill through the small room. "You think my home, Tartarus 9, is just a failed agricultural colony. You think we are poor, wretched farmers clinging to the edge of the galaxy out of sheer, stubborn pride. She leaned forward, resting her arms on her knees, and the shadows of the room seemed to bend and cling to her skin. Tartarus 9 is not a farm, Cedric. It is a natural planetary super-maximum prison. For over 200 years, the Central Earth government has secretly used our world as a dumping ground for the most aggressively lethal, invasive alien species they could find in the deep black. Whenever they discovered a parasite, a predator, or a biomechanical plague they could not control or domesticate, they dropped it onto our soil. They turned our home into an absolute, living hell, just to observe how the local ecosystem would react. They wanted to study extreme survival and weaponize the biological results. Cedric felt his stomach twist violently. The geopolitical implications were horrifying. But they made one catastrophic miscalculation, Alara continued, her tone hardening into sharp, unforgiving steel. They assumed the humans they abandoned down there would be the very first victims. They assumed my ancestors would simply die out in a few short months. But humanity is not meant to be prey. We did not die. We were subjected to a forced, agonizing evolutionary crucible. Over the span of 10 generations, my people broke every single biological limit imposed upon our species. Our bone and muscle density increased exponentially. Our senses sharpened to rival the beasts that hunted us in the dark. We learned how to consume toxic flora and metabolize pure poison. The government wanted to find the ultimate weapon, and they created us instead. We became the apex predators. We are the monsters that completely control the hell they built. The revelation hit Cedric like a physical kinetic strike. Alara and her people were not tragic refugees. They were a genetically hardened warrior race, bred in the hottest fires of a galactic fighting pit. But that brings us to the second lie, Alara said, standing up and methodically checking the charge on her improvised thermobaric explosives. The arrival of this biological mass was not a random accident. Deep space trawling nets do not just randomly snag a hibernating alien hive. Your esteemed board of directors found the mother node coordinates on a highly classified black market data drive. They intentionally brought it aboard the Ethel Guard. They wanted to study its assimilation capabilities to create stealth bioarmor for highly lucrative military contracts. Cedric stared at her in absolute, sickening horror. The corporate elites had willingly brought an apocalyptic plague onto a civilian yacht just to boost their quarterly profit margins. "And you?" Cedric asked, his voice barely a whisper, the pieces finally falling into place. "Why were you transferred here?" "I am not a botanist," Alara replied coldly, locking her heavy spear securely into her gauntlet. "The frontier resistance intercepted the encrypted corporate communications. I was sent here on a strict, undercover mandate. My mission was never to integrate with this crew or water their decorative plants. My mission is to ensure this corrupt, rotting laboratory is completely erased from existence, and to execute the mother node before she can spread her parasitic spores to the heavily populated inner sectors." She turned toward the sealed blast door, listening intently to the heavy, scratching sounds of the drone pack slowly closing in on their isolated position. "I am not here to save the elites, Cedric," she said, her voice completely devoid of mercy or hesitation. "I am here to burn their sins to the ground." The air inside the main reactor core was thick, with a pulsating, sickly, violet light. The mother node did not just dwell within the fusion chamber. She had completely assimilated the Ethel Guard's central AI, turning the ship itself into her extended, writhing nervous system. Every bulkhead, every ventilation duct, and every automated system was under her direct command. As Cedric and Alara stepped onto the final gantry, the heavy blast doors slammed shut, sealing them inside a tomb. The ship began a rapid, irreversible countdown. The mother node intended to trigger a total reactor collapse, turning the Ethel Guard into a massive kinetic bomb to scatter her infectious spores across the neighboring star systems. The node's intelligence surged forward, not with physical tendrils, but with a weaponized psychic pulse. She flooded their minds with a raw, overwhelming hallucination of their most buried, primal fears. Cedric fell to his knees instantly, his mind trapped in a visceral nightmare of his own failures and his impending, agonizing death. His vision blurred, his heart hammered against his ribs, and his muscles locked in total, paralyzed submission. But Alara did not stop. She didn't even slow her pace. She walked forward through the crushing psychic storm with the steady, rhythmic stride of a soldier on a parade ground. The mother node shrieked in confusion, doubling the intensity of the fear projection. She tried to manifest every possible terror, every instinctual horror known to the biological mind. But she found absolutely nothing to latch onto. Alara looked up at the towering mass of alien flesh and smiled, an expression of pure, predatory amusement. The truth was absolute. The amygdala, the section of the human brain responsible for processing fear, had been completely pruned away from her people through 10 generations of forced survival on Tartarus 9. They had no capacity for terror. They knew only tactical calculation, cold geometry, and the efficient destruction of their enemies. "You are searching for a weakness that no longer exists," Alara whispered, stepping within reach of the node. Using Cedric's shouted technical instructions, she bypassed the reactor's final safety interlocks, pushing the power output to 200%. As the core began to scream, she pulled a small, silver vial of highly concentrated antibodies from her suit and injected it directly into her own veins. She then stepped directly into the path of the node's primary feeding tentacle. The creature lunged, eager to devour the defiant girl, and buried its sharp, hungry fangs into her outstretched forearm. The moment the alien blood touched the modified antibodies in her system, a catastrophic, systemic chain reaction occurred. The plague's DNA was rewritten in seconds, turning her blood into a localized biological toxin that ravaged the mother node's genetic structure from the inside out. The creature's collective consciousness shrieked as it disintegrated into acidic dust. As the Ethelgard began to tear itself apart in a massive, final eruption of fusion energy, Alara grabbed the stunned Cedric. She dragged him into the last operational escape pod, slamming the manual override just before the entire reactor block detonated, vaporizing the ship and the corrupt board of directors who had engineered their own extinction. They drifted through the silent, glittering void, waiting for a long-range rescue signal to be picked up by the border patrol. Inside the cramped pod, the silence was total. Cedric watched, eyes wide, as Alara sat on the floor, calmly pulling out a piece of preserved fruit and peeling it with a small utility knife as if she had just finished cleaning a cluttered room. He realized then that the galaxy had fundamentally misunderstood humanity. They looked at the soft, fragile skin of humans and assumed weakness. They didn't see the iron-forged endurance hidden beneath. In the darkest corners of the universe, humanity was the species that monsters should pray they never encountered. The legend of the Deathworld survivor had just been born, and it would serve as a permanent warning to anything foolish enough to cross their path. Thank you so much to everyone for listening to this story today. We are genuinely curious. Where in the world are you tuning in from? If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, please consider supporting the channel with just $1. You can scan the QR code on your screen or use the donation link in the description or comments below. Your contribution helps us pay our staff so they can provide for their families and continue creating even more captivating stories for you. Thank you for being such an incredible audience, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next episode.